Well, Johann van Loggerenberg doesn't often look like a prize fighter, but he certainly does now. We'll have a story. There's a big story behind that as well. But the main reason why I asked Johan to join us today is to discuss the book of the moment. Here it is, Andre de Ruyter's Truth to Power. It's an exceptional, it's almost like a docket, a criminal docket, every page with names in it. Johan worked for Pravin Gordhan at the South African Revenue Services. You might also remember Johan's history. He was accused of being in a rogue unit at SARS, which wasn't. He was an investigator who exposed lots of malfeasance, a big whistleblower himself. And I'm very interested to hear, as I'm sure you will be, about what he has to make of the de Ruyter book. Well, very good to be talking with you again, Johan. We always have these fascinating discussions, but my goodness, when I saw over the weekend on social media that you almost weren't going to be with us today, what happened?
Yeah, no, it was quite harrowing. I think I just became a statistic, as many of my fellow South Africans on a daily basis. I went out cycling, as I normally do on weekends, and I got jumped by 4 very aggressive, violent, bad people. And I got robbed. But I'm just thankful to be alive, and that's the main thing.
So they obviously punched you or perhaps hit you with stuff. Were they, when you say aggressive and violent, do you have any idea what their motive was apart from stealing your bicycle?
I don't know. They were angry people, and they hit me with bricks, and then one had a knife with him. What they stole was not really valuable because I rode on a fairly cheap off-the-rack bicycle. My phone that I used was quite old. It's not in production anymore. They took my wallet, but and I gave them my PIN numbers, but they didn't draw any money, so I didn't lose any money there. And a bracelet, which is not valuable at all. It's just sentimental, and the watch. So that's what if they make 4,000 Rand between the 5 of them, because there was also a getaway driver, I would be surprised. The aggression, I suppose, one can have a long conversation about why. But yeah, they really hurt me. Even after they'd taken everything they wanted, they kept on hurting me for a while. So yeah, it was...
And when you reflect on that, does it make you feel any differently about our future in the country, or just illustrate the challenges that we face?
No, I think I actually, in my Facebook post, I actually made the point that it helps me to also consider them as victims of a different kind. I think they're products of our society. We are not born to be that violent. Some things have occurred in their lives to make them that violent. And I think, if anything, I think that's a conversation to be had, is why are we so violent as a society? Because I had submitted, I had offered to them everything that they wanted to take from me. So the violence was completely unnecessary, and yet they kept on, So there's obviously, I think psychologists and psychiatrists can probably speak to this more, but there's obviously something that made them that way, callous, aggressive, angry, and so on. There's a lot of anger there. Yeah.
And where did this happen?
It happened not far from my house, actually quite near the State Security Agency's main headquarters on the Delmas Road, near the Rietvlei Game Reserve, which one would expect as a national key point would be a fairly safe area. But yeah, as I say, these things happen every day in our country. So I'm actually fortunate. What struck me when I went to hospital yesterday is that I'm I became acutely aware of my privilege because I obviously had access to the best of doctors. I didn't have to queue. All the equipment worked. The equipment was there. They did a CT scan. They did the X-ray scans. And I was lying there because they keep you, because their protocols say that, when you have a head injury, you should be observed for a time. And they put me on painkillers and on a drip. I just became so aware of the stark contrasts in our society. And I actually thought of these guys. And I thought, if something like this had to happen to any one of them, they would not have that privilege of going to a good hospital and get the kind of service that I got. And there are quite a few metaphors for me in there, if you think of it. They'd probably have to end up queuing at one of the state hospitals, and who knows what kind of service they would have gotten there. So, yeah, that's just the way I am. I think about things like that.
Sure. That's extraordinary generosity of spirit. I think that some other people might say it was a message from above that A, don't go cycling, and B, what the heck are you doing living in a country that's so violent and so crazy? But we're here to make a difference. You've made a difference your whole life. You've worked for a higher purpose. And I was wondering with the Andre de Ruyter book, whether you saw in that any parallels with your own experience at SARS and the state capture that occurred there.
It would be a very difficult comparison to do for me, Alec, off the cuff. Naturally, at obvious superficial level, the common denominator would be that it appears to be that we are both people who were occupying a certain office in the state, so to speak, in the broad sense, that happen to be entities that are under siege, or were, in my case, under siege at the time, and that we both tried to do something about it, and ultimately wrote books about it. I think that would be, at the most superficial level, the commonality. I think beyond that, I wouldn't want to compare the two of us at all. I happen to have known about, what's become known in some circles as the Fiver's dossiers, these intelligence reports. Even before it was publicly known, and I had read some of them. And that certainly concerned me. It concerned me in the main because I could, apart from where it came from, I could just read from the content that it was the typical stuff that's been littered in our history since '94. These intelligence dossiers, in inverted commas. That's always a concoction of a little bit of fact and a lot of fiction and speculation, and it's always unattributed and it lacks specificity, and those things cause more harm than good, regardless of the intent, because it's certainly not something that you can take to a court. It's it poisons any kind of criminal investigation from the word go if there's the kind of nonsense that that I could see in there. Absolute blatant factual inaccuracies that are just so easy to check. But of course, these things are designed to appeal to the emotion rather than the cognitive weighing up of fact and looking at facts clinically, as court processes and investigations require one to do. And then the difficulty, of course, is because they are coined intelligence and they use terms like anonymous sources and so on, you never have the benefit of pressure testing that. And so unless you have a built-in counterintelligence methodology, you're always going to simply recount what people want you to recount, and you will do it indiscriminately. So it deeply concerned me at the time that I also happened to know what these things were costing. It concerned me. Set aside, who the author was, the primary author. It just really concerned me that this was kind of the main source of direction in terms of the high-level corruption that was supposedly going on at Eskom, because it naturally undermines the real investigation, and it creates space for the real crooks because it's a distraction, and it confuses, and it does what fake news does in the media world. It causes doubt, and you just don't know, and so I actually have the book, but I haven't read it yet because I'm in two minds. I'm not certain if I want to read the book because I just won't know what parts to believe and what parts not. It's just, and it's not a criticism of de Ruyter as a person. It's, I don't know his background all that well, other than that he comes from business and he was trained as a lawyer. But I questioned the decision to use the services of the company that they used in such a lackadaisical fashion at that cost. You only have to Google that company's name to see the controversies it's been involved in over the years, going back to that DA bugging scandal. Apart from that, I've not seen much success reported on in the public domain in terms of what that company's ever produced. That's resulted in major seizures or prosecutions or arrests or the shutdown of syndicates or anything like that. It's not. It would certainly not be my first choice of a company whose services I would acquire to do that kind of work for an entity like Eskom, given the circumstances under which Eskom found itself at that time. And more so because you're not using taxpayers' money, you're actually using, I think, donor money or grant money or whatever you want to call it. It came from the private sector. You should have checked around. I think there are people and entities out there that can do a proper job, for probably less money.
It's interesting perspective that you've provided us there. And indeed, it was paid for by a philanthropist and it was paid for by private sector donations. But the interesting part that I found in the book was de Ruyter's own experiences. The direct experiences. In other words, the stuff that he saw when he went to a plant and he looked at the numbers, and there was 1.3 billion rands worth of products that had been purchased which just simply weren't there. And many of those examples, it just goes on and on and on. And we can remember, you more than most people, that during the Gupta era, they completely controlled Eskom. Mark Pomensky, the feedback, the sources I had was that they really were completely ripping the place out. And I had a number of examples of that, which we published on BizNews. And you would have had even more exposure to this through the time at SARS. Taking outside of that investigation, though, another of the controversies in the book, to a degree, is the relationship that de Ruyter had with Pravin Gordhan. On the one hand, it's quite clear that they're ideological opposite poles. On the other hand, it's also clear that he has a huge regard for Pravin Gordhan as a individual. He said, for instance, after he was poisoned, that Pravin Gordhan took the trouble to drive all the way out to de Ruyter's home in Hermanus to come and see how he was, which he contrasts with the chairman of Eskom, who he said completely, virtually ignored the whole thing. Now, you worked for Pravin at South African Revenue Services. What is your reading of the relationship that, first of all, you had with him, and indeed that the criticisms that de Ruyter has here?
Look, I should just speak to the first part of what you said. Look, I think that Eskom is a primary site of looting and has been for many, many years, even before the state capture period, it cannot be doubted and it cannot be disputed. And I think any person who is placed in a position to go and visit the different sites will see evidence of that. The fundamental question for me is how you go about dealing with it. And if your primary solution is to appoint some outfit to go and conduct intelligence, then make sure that you hit the spot. And check the stuff. So that's one comment, which is something that perhaps in the Ruyter's naivety or lack of understanding of the investigative and quasi-intelligence environment, maybe he thought that because it's a former police commissioner, that's good enough. I don't know. But by the third or fourth report, they should have realized, hang on, people, we must double check this stuff. This is, so that's one comment. In terms of my relationship with Mr. Gordhan, look, he was at best twice or thrice removed as direct line management, but I did deal with him from time to time, obviously, on matters and so on. In his capacity as commissioner, in my years at the Revenue Service. And I found him to be a tough boss. He is a tough boss. And it's because he's tough on himself. He works like a machine, and he expects people who work with him to also work like machines. And he makes sure that we understand that the struggle continues. That it did not end in '94. It's just taken a different form. I often disagreed with him, not often, but I did disagree with him on occasion. And the manner in which he responds is to push back. And if you're going to have a thin skin, or if your ego is going to come in the way, you're going to experience it in a particular way. In our time, the culture at the Revenue Service was such that it was okay to push back and to disagree because it pushed us to try better and think more and think wider and think from different angles and so on. But they certainly were never comfortable. They were never comfortable engagements when there were disagreements. But I suppose he kept on looking for emergence. How can something better come out of this? So he was very challenging in that sense. Nothing would ever be good enough, until finally, you come close to, okay, this is something that we may be able to work with. And that's just, I think, in his nature. And I can easily understand why some people will think that is some form of a micromanagement. So I think, it's fair to, if you have a certain kind of personality, you would certainly experience that as somebody who interferes or who isn't happy with what you're doing, or who's criticizing what you're doing, but you can look at it the other way too, and that's how we looked at it. It's like he kept on challenging us, and now we're going to show him we're going to do this differently, or we're going to do it better than he thinks. But this is a man who really is formidable in his thinking. He can move between the strategic, and I'm talking about like 100, 200-year lifespan. He thinks that far ahead in life. And then he can drop straight into the absolute tactical of, right now, within the minute, or what's the next steps that you're going to do and what happened yesterday. Which was, it is kind of unsettling until you get used to his management style, and then you realize that this man he's just got a very good brain. And if you can connect with him in a working environment, then he does have this ability to make you want to do your best. and it's okay to also fail. He is forgiving in that sense. He'll give you a lot of room to repair and fix.
Johan, that's fantastic context. Thank you, because it certainly does give at least one other side to the relationship that de Ruyter had with Gordhan. And we do know that Gordhan stood firm, almost single-handedly, against the corruption wave of the Zuma era. And so to perhaps have some context into his relationship here is very good. I urge you to read the book. I'd be delighted to pick up with you again when you've done so. But it's really good talking with you. I'm so pleased that you came through your ordeal as a forgiving South African, and it really does show the generosity of spirit that Johann van Loggerenberg has. I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.